The Allies are advancing on two fronts as the race for control of Berlin plays out. Adolf Hitler is out of sight, hidden beneath the streets of the city. And when Berlin finally falls, he is gone. The fate of one of the most evil men in history had become a baffling mystery. The details that have slowly emerged over the decades are sketchy. Most believe he shot himself on April 30th, 1945. Wife Eva Braun was dead by his side from cyanide poisoning. Hitler's aides hastily burned both bodies, then buried them near the emergency exit to the bunker on the left of this 1947 photo. But no one saw Hitler pull the trigger. No photographs were taken, and no body was ever produced.
No one actually saw Adolf Hitler shoot himself or Eva Braun commit suicide. It remains impossible, really, to prove conclusively that Hitler did shoot himself.
But some facts are beyond dispute. German officials announced Hitler's death on May 1st. "24 hours later, Russian forces captured the bunker and claimed Hitler's body was nowhere to be found. Even more mysteriously, dictator Joseph Stalin maintained until his own death that Hitler had gotten away. Had he escaped to live out his days plotting revenge? For years after the war, there were sightings of Hitler from South America to Europe. U.S. intelligence even created these mock-ups to help agents determine what he might have looked like had he changed his appearance.
There were reports that Hitler was not only alive, but living somewhere in the British occupation zone in northwestern Germany.
In 1968, the Russians changed their account of his death, saying they had evidence to prove Hitler had died in the bunker. They claimed they uncovered the partially charred corpses of Hitler and Braun in 1945. What they didn't reveal until decades later was that they had buried the bodies at a military compound in Magdeburg, Germany. The bodies remained there for 2 decades, until 1970, when they were dug up again.
And it was around April of 1970 that the head of the KGB ordered that the remains of Adolf Hitler, Eva Braun, were to be disinterred, and this time the remains destroyed.
The mainstream belief is that the Russians then cremated the remains and scattered the ashes in the Elbe River. Then in 1993 came another shocking twist to the official Russian account, when they revealed they had physical proof of Hitler's death hidden away in Moscow, including a sofa supposedly stained with Hitler's blood, a portion of his jawbone, and even more significantly, a piece of skull with a bullet hole in it. The Russians have always restricted access to the evidence, and it has never been tested using modern forensic technology. Now, Mystery Quest will travel to Russia in an attempt to gain unprecedented access to the remaining physical evidence. If successful, they will attempt to conduct the world's first DNA tests on that evidence. The results could rewrite history. They will also go to Germany to interview the last living member of Hitler's inner circle, a guard who was in the bunker during those final hours. The team will test the historical account of Hitler's death by using the latest 3D animation to recreate the bunker. And Mystery Quest will excavate the sites where the Russians claim Hitler was buried to try to find new evidence of his remains. Russia's secrecy is legendary, and the evidence they hold has rarely been seen and never tested. It is held here deep within the Russian Federation State Archive. Intense negotiations with state officials have resulted in Mystery Quest being granted 1 day's access to examine the evidence. Dr. Nick Bellantoni, the Connecticut state archaeologist, will head the Mystery Quest investigation. But before he can start, Bellantoni hits a roadblock. The archive is refusing to grant him the agreed-to access. Heated negotiations take place off-camera. Finally, the Russians relent. But Bellantoni will get just 60 minutes to examine all the documents and gather samples needed for testing.
We have less than an hour to compile all the biological data we need to take back with us. So it's not an ideal situation, certainly by any means, but we'll get something.
The accepted version of Hitler's death comes mainly from a 1945 report from the British Army. It was the result of a brief investigation by Major Hugh Trevor Roper.
On November 1st, 1945, he provided conclusions of his investigation, which was that Eva Braun had taken poison and that Hitler had shot himself.
But Trevor Roper was given little cooperation and relied mainly on eyewitness accounts.
The Soviets controlled access to the bunker. Trevor Roper was not able to conduct any kind of serious, extensive investigation.
Only one of the eyewitnesses to Hitler's last days is still alive. Rochus Misch was in the Führer's bunker on April 30th, 1945. Now 92, Misch was just 27 when he was a member of Hitler's elite bodyguard unit. He remembers Hitler's last instructions.
He said, "The war is lost, and nobody is obliged to anything. Everybody is free to go. Only those have to remain who are needed." That was us, the ones who had to execute their duties until the end.
Hitler was paranoid about being captured by the Russians. He began methodically planning his own death.
Hitler had asked his doctor, "I will kill myself. What's the best way?" So Professor Hase explained to him, capsule and shooting at the same time. That would be best.
Misch says he did not hear the shot, but others did.
I was standing in the hallway, and somebody shouted. The person had heard the shot. I didn't.
He claims he saw the lifeless bodies of Hitler and his wife, Eva Braun.
Of course I was curious. I took a step forward to look inside. I will never forget this. Hitler by the table, his head on the table. And Eva lay on the couch, her head towards him.
But Misch has changed his story over the years. He claimed in past interviews he did hear the shot that killed Hitler. So how reliable is his testimony? and that of other eyewitnesses. This man doesn't believe the eyewitnesses.
First of all, nobody found the corpse of either Hitler or Eva Braun. All the testimony of the key witnesses are very contradictory.
Author H.D. Bauman spent 6 years researching his recent book about Hitler's fate.
Stalin told the Allied leaders in Potsdam in July 1945 that Hitler escaped to Spain or Argentina.
He's convinced Hitler got away.
I don't believe Hitler died in a bunker.
Now, the evidence in Moscow could help prove it.
This is actually an extraordinary opportunity.
Mystery Quest has journeyed to Germany and Russia to search for clues about the mysterious death of Adolf Hitler. The alleged site of his death, the Führer bunker, was designed as a temporary shelter. But by April 21, 1945, Russian shelling was so bad that Hitler was forced to stay below ground at all times. Few were allowed on the lower level, the Führer's private rooms. Hitler's bodyguard, Roches Misch, was often stationed there on protection detail.
Nobody was allowed inside the bunker, just Hitler and us. Those were Hitler's living quarters.
Hitler was defiant to the end, but told aides he feared being captured.
The Soviets were preparing to close in on the very center of Berlin. It would be impossible to hold out much longer.
On April 29th, Hitler married his longtime companion, Eva Braun. The next day, the Führer met with his few remaining friends and staff outside his study to say goodbye. Then Hitler and Eva closed themselves into the room. Misch remained at his post. He says someone yelled they'd heard a shot, but no one moved.
A lot of time passed until somebody said, "Now open the door."
He says he saw both Hitler and Eva dead. Minutes later, he saw the Führer's body wrapped in a blanket being carried down a hall outside to the Chancellery garden.
They passed me, and I could still see the shoes. They weren't covered.
The Führer had ordered his aides to burn his and Eva's bodies. He had secretly feared that the Russians would display his dead body.
He learned about what happened to Benito Mussolini, that Mussolini had been executed and that his body and the body of Mussolini's mistress had been strung up outside a gas station in Milan.
Unable to fully burn the corpses, aides allegedly buried them on the bunker grounds. A short time later, the Russians found a corpse there they believed was Hitler's and took this photo.
Hitler was like a lot of political leaders. He occasionally made use of a double or a doppelganger.
And many think one may have taken his place. Author H.D. Bauman claims Hitler's practice of using a double increased after July 20th, 1944, when an attempt to kill him was staged by opponents in the German army. Called Operation Valkyrie, it was unsuccessful, but 200 people connected to the attempted coup were executed as a result. The attempt scared aides who forced Hitler to keep a lower public profile.
He was kept in hiding most of the time.
The double also added to the confusion surrounding Hitler's death.
The double got killed by the German security service April 30th. The Russians discovered this corpse in a shallow grave on May 2nd. And for the first 2 days, the Russians believed it. And they displayed it in the courtyard of the Reichschancellery, and they took photographs and so on. But then found out that he was 2 inches too short. His ears were a little different.
According to Baumann, Stalin was now more certain than ever that Hitler had escaped. Some believe Hitler may have fled even earlier. Nazi pilot Hanne Reich is known to have flown out of Berlin on April 29th after meeting with Hitler. Some think the Führer was aboard the 2-seater plane. Reich evaded heavy Allied fire and escaped. She denied until her death that Hitler was with her. Baumann believes Hitler then traveled by U-boat to Argentina. And Baumann isn't alone.
The FBI did investigate the many rumors that came out of Argentina, but not much came out of it.
The FBI officially closed the case on Hitler's death in 1956, 11 years after the war ended. But due to the contradictory nature of the Russian accounts, the speculation about what really happened to Hitler has persisted. The Führer bunker was located directly beneath the Reichschancellery, which was Nazi Germany's capital building. It was divided into 2 levels, an office level which also housed inner staff, and a lower level where Hitler's living quarters were. The bunker itself is gone. It was destroyed in 1947 and paved over in the 50s. This is what it looks like today. The expedition team, led by animator Christoph Neubauer, is trying to verify the accounts of Hitler's death given by his bodyguard, Roches Misch. To do this, he is creating an animated reconstruction of the Führer bunker. Neubauer is using only architectural plans and photographs as sources in building the model.
The most difficult part is, of course, the research to find really reliable information, which is not eyewitness account.
He starts at the site of the bunker.
Here, exactly on the spot, 7 meters underground, would have been the place where Hitler committed suicide. And they had to move him into the garden. From here they had the problem, there was a lot of shooting, so they had to find a quick spot to burn him. So they moved more or less 4 meters further into a ditch. So here they dropped him, and here they burned him. And it's also the place where the Russians found him several days later.
Dr. Nick Bellantoni has just an hour to examine the Hitler evidence in the Russian archive. He begins by examining a stack of documents known as the Operation Myth files. Operation Myth was launched by Russian dictator Joseph Stalin in December 1945 to investigate the circumstances surrounding Hitler's death. He named it Myth because he suspected Hitler's death was a myth and that he had, in fact, escaped. The files are a compilation of forensic reports and witness interrogations. Among the documents, Bellantoni makes a surprise discovery. A map of the bunker drawn by Hitler's bodyguard, Roches Misch. But the clock is ticking, and Bellantoni is forced to move on. He moves to a fragment of the sofa where Hitler reportedly died.
Look how dark the stains are when this was freshly taken, and look how faded the stains are now today. That's pretty dramatic, actually.
Bellantoni begins by using cotton swabs to moisten old, dried blood so that he can lift a viable DNA sample to test.
I'd like to give another sample. I'm getting a little discoloration. The problem is, in terms of a potential DNA analysis, we're probably getting the contamination of people that have touched this over the years so many times. But let's take the sample back.
He takes samples from 5 different parts of the sofa, putting each into a separate envelope so there's no cross-contamination. Next, he examines the skull. The bullet wound is clear.
It looks like an exit wound. This would be the back of the cranial vault, right about in here.
The skull does show evidence of exposure to fire. Using a special chart to look at bone color and cracking, Bellantoni determines that the skull was not burned for long.
There is some burning going on here, not a cremation, but a burning nonetheless.
With time running out to record the evidence, Bellantoni takes photographs and makes sketches. He also gathers a physical sample for testing.
Because of the way this has been stored in, bone is flaking off.
The fragments will allow Mystery Quest to perform the world's first DNA analysis of the skull.
What we'll do at this point now is to take all of the photographic evidence we have, the samples we have taken, along with the information of the crania that we have, and we'll bring these all back to the United States and do some laboratory analysis to see what we can extract here that might help us with this mystery.
Mystery Quest is searching Europe for answers about the mysterious death of Adolf Hitler. Christoph Neubauer is leading the expedition in Berlin. He does not believe the eyewitness accounts of Roches Misch and others are true. He's gathering evidence to test their stories below ground. During the war, the Germans built a massive network of bunkers and tunnels under Berlin. Some are still accessible today, virtually unchanged. Neubauer meets underground expert Sascha Keil. Structural details like corridor length, wall thickness, and acoustics will allow him to create the most realistic model. Their first stop should provide information about the materials and construction of walls.
Here it gives me actually an indication how Hitler's bunker could have actually been structured.
In one room, they discover a large generator.
Wow. Is this the original one?
Yeah, completely. 100%, and it is still in function after so many decades. It's the last one remaining from these engines.
The same model generated power for the Führer bunker.
We are now in the cellar, and this is an emergency shaft going from the cellar to the roof. And you can climb up totally to the roof.
Okay, this is actually very interesting, because the Russian reports say that we had exactly such an emergency exit in a Führer bunker. From there you could actually come into the garden.
The emergency hatch shows how Hitler could have escaped from his study. Dr. Nick Bellantoni is also now in Germany. He's traveled here from Moscow, hoping to examine the site where Hitler is thought to have been buried. In 1946, a Russian covert unit called Smersh is said to have moved Hitler's corpse an hour southwest from Berlin to a military base in Magdeburg. Smersh, which in English means death to spies, was founded during the war to keep the Red Army free of traitors, deserters, and spies. But after the war, Stalin used Smersh to find out what had happened to Adolf Hitler. The account of their investigation is part of the Operation Myth files Bellantoni was able to examine in Moscow. Smersh allegedly found Hitler's charred corpse at the bunker on May 4th, 1945, then buried it in Magdeburg, where it remained undisturbed until 1970, when the Russians decided to destroy it once and for all.
This renovated residence that we're standing in front of was actually officers' quarters for the Russian army in the late 1940s. And it was here that Adolf Hitler was buried until 1970. So we're hoping to take a look at the land, see the area where the former courtyard used to be, and see if we can find any physical evidence of where the burials might have been located.
Bellantoni is led to the area where the bodies are believed to have been buried.
As you can see, the land has been overgrown, the land use, much of the stuff that's happened here, the root systems and the hard earth, we're really not going to, our investigation will not yield much information here.
Russian records show that Hitler's body was taken 10 miles from Magdeburg and then cremated in front of a morgue. Bellantoni hopes to find cremated bone fragments to corroborate that the skull in Moscow is real. But the location is not marked, and the only clue is an article from a local archive containing a photo of the place.
We're just coming from the archive, and they've led us to this general area of the Soviet camp. Unfortunately, they only have one article that was of use to us, but what is important here is that that article's photograph is helpful in hopefully finding out where on this property the crematory was located. We're going to have to use this photograph like a detective would. I could see a tower, there's a field, and a grove of trees. The tower and field really come into perspective now. The legs on the tower are too wide apart from this perspective compared to what's in the photograph. So we still got to go further, but clearly we're on the right trail. Look at this, a slab. We've got cement slab over here. This is it. This is it.
This is the morgue. According to the eyewitness account, Adolf Hitler's final cremation was out here in the front of the morgue, probably about where I'm standing.
Bellantoni begins digging a test pit 10 feet from where the front of the building used to be. He is looking for bone fragments to compare against the skull fragments from Russia.
We're not seeing much for artifacts at this point.
No bone is found, but samples from the different layers of the pit are taken for chemical analysis. Bellantoni has gathered the evidence necessary to test the Russian account of Hitler's death.
Our studies have been basically exploratory, but clearly this has the potential of yielding more information.
Mystery Quest is investigating what happened to Adolf Hitler at the end of World War II. For decades, speculation has raged that Hitler escaped Germany and lived out his days plotting revenge. The Russians, who claim they discovered his body, have changed their account of what happened numerous times. Now, Mystery Quest has been given access to the physical evidence the Russians say proves Hitler did die in his bunker. Dr. Nick Bellantoni is back in the U.S. to test the blood, skull, and soil samples collected from Europe. The science team begins by looking for traces of Hitler's bones from his reported burial site in Germany.
I have a couple of samples from Germany for you. It might be what we're looking for.
But the soil does not reveal any traces of human remains that can be compared against the skull fragments to confirm they are Hitler's. Bellantoni next performs a forensic examination of the high-resolution images he took of the skull. He's noticed something.
Well, upon our return from Russia, one of the things we wanted to do was take a look at our photographs that we have, blow them up, and really see if we can really get some good detail on top of the forensic information we achieved there. A few things that are pretty striking here and actually problematic. One thing we had noticed in Russia, and really are highlighted here in these photographs, are the sutures are very open. And what the sutures are, if I can use this model, are basically where the various skull plates come together and you get this little jigsaw line where the bones come together. Really what happens basically as you get older, they start obliterating. We know Hitler died at 56 years of age and really quite open for someone of that age bracket. These look very young, like more someone that's 20 to 40 years old.
And there's something even more shocking about this piece of skull.
The other thing that we noted also in Russia and see here very much in these photographs is the thinness of the vault plate. It's rather small, and as a result, it's something we would not expect from an adult male. Usually males are more robust. If the police brought us this, we would have thought it was a woman, to be honest with you.
This could mean that the skull the Russians have held for decades isn't Hitler's at all. The DNA tests on the skull fragments and sofa should prove more definitively whether the skull is Hitler's. Those tests are being conducted at the University of Connecticut Center for Applied Genetics. Director Linda Strasbaugh will oversee the attempt to extract DNA from the samples. It will be difficult due to the age and condition of the samples.
The fragments are badly charred, and this is the forensic scientist or historic DNA scientist's worst nightmare. It's one of the biggest challenges for getting DNA from burnt pieces of bone. The pieces are very small, and we just aren't certain how much luck we're going to have in coaxing DNA out of these samples. We'll be taking extreme caution with these samples. We'll be using full forensic procedures to avoid contamination.
They begin by soaking the samples overnight in a special chemical solution. If the process is successful, the science team will be one step closer to determining whether the skull and sofa fragments really contain Hitler's DNA. The next morning, the team removes the samples from the roller, and the bone fragments are ground into a fine powder.
For the bone fragments, we actually powder the bone to make it easier for the solution to get in and lift the DNA out.
To their surprise, the team succeeds in identifying viable DNA in both the skull and sofa samples.
Oh, wow.
But we got something.
Looks like we actually got something.
The bone fragment, I'm really surprised at that. And the swab, goodness.
They will now isolate and replicate the DNA through a process called molecular copying. This will give the scientists more material to look at. The analysis will potentially call into question all conventional beliefs about Hitler's death.
Looking at the bones, I thought there was a possibility, but I never really imagined that it really would come out this way. Wow.
Mystery Quest has undertaken an expedition to Eastern Europe to try to determine whether Adolf Hitler died in 1945 or somehow escaped. This man, a former Nazi bodyguard, insists he saw Hitler and Eva Braun dead in a Berlin bunker. This author believes Hitler faked his death and escaped to Argentina. This scientist is testing the only known physical evidence of Hitler's body. In Berlin, Christoph Neubauer is unveiling his animated reconstruction of the bunker. He is using it to test the accuracy of eyewitness Roches Misch. This is the garden of the Reichskanzlei, under which the bunker was located. The upper level is where most of the staff was positioned. Hitler lived one level down. This is the door to his private quarters. Neubauer doubts the claim of Misch that he saw or heard Hitler die.
It appears that in the main bunker, that the engine room was right next to Misch's room. They had the submarine diesel engine running, which is very loud. We have proof that you could not hear this engine running outside the rooms. So there it gives us an indication how protective actually such walls were. There's no way he could have heard anything.
And neither could anyone in the upper bunker, where most of the other eyewitnesses were.
The upper bunker was almost 4 meters apart and also 2 meters higher than actually Hitler's bunker. No way that anybody could have heard anything up there. No way.
The accepted historical report of Hitler's death appears based on unreliable eyewitness evidence. Now, the analysis of the science team will be vital in determining whether the rest of the Russian account is true. Dr. Nick Bellantoni doesn't think the skull the Russians say is Hitler's is really his. He says the areas where the skull plates come together indicate the skull belongs to someone much younger than Hitler would have been at the time of his death, and may even belong to a female. The team was able to extract something called allosomal DNA from the skull and blood evidence.